Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Acupuncture is My Life show. Now, today I plan to discuss the functions of the spleen. Now, remember, I'm going through each and every one of the internal organs for a reason. And that reason is because in later episodes, I plan to discuss diseases, how they affect the human body, how it is diagnosed by an acupuncturist, as well as treated. And unless you understand the basic functions of the internal organs from an acupuncturist perspective, it'll confuse you, it'll throw you off, and which isn't good, of course. All right. And I also want you to understand, as a state licensed, board certified doctor of acupuncture, the internal organs to an acupuncturist in Eastern medicine functions quite differently to that of the internal organs, its overall concept, in Western medicine. Okay? So, before discussing the functions of the spleen, I'm going to ask that you momentarily attempt to block your understanding of the Western concept of the internal organs completely. Ready? Now, an acupuncturist understands the functions of the spleen to be that the spleen governs the transformation as well as the transporting of food essences, chi, as well as fluids. You see, the spleen also controls the ascending of chi within the body, as well as it controls the blood. So, chi that is made from food essences by the spleen goes up. Keep that in mind, because the spleen and the stomach represent the core of the human organism, and all essences and chi are derived from that. And spleen sends its chi up, and the stomach sends its chi down. So please remember that, because when I get into diseases, it'll all make sense. It'll explain as to why some individuals experience diarrhea, constipation, vomiting, heartburn, and so forth and so on. But I can't just jump right into that without getting you to understand the functions of the spleen from an acupuncturist point of view. Okay? Now, an acupuncturist also understands that the spleen also controls the muscles and the forelimbs, and it manifests in a person's lips. And I know a lot of you are like, what? But this comes down to diagnosis. Now, when I say the spleen governs transformation and transporting of food essences and chi, I mean this process happens by way of the spleen transforming food and liquids in which we ingest into chi, which serves as the foundation for the production of chi and blood, which is then transported to various parts of the body for required nourishment. Now, when it comes to the fluids, the spleen functions to separate usable from unusable fluids. Now, as for the spleen controlling the ascending of chi, the spleen is responsible for sending the chi, which is derived, as I stated, from food and fluids, which is the usable part of the fluids, up to the lungs and the heart to form chi and blood, because you need oxygen and other things. So, now when it comes to the spleen controlling blood, there are two aspects to this function. One is the chi from the spleen is responsible for holding blood within the blood vessels. And an example of that is, let's say, when spleen chi is deficient, a person would experience internal hemorrhaging. And when that happens, an acupuncturist automatically knows it's spleen qi deficiency, tonify spleen qi. Another way the spleen controls the blood is that the qi extracted from the food by the spleen is sent upwards to the heart to form blood. Now, the spleen is also responsible for controlling the muscles and forelimbs by way of extracting qi from the food to nourish all tissues throughout the body. Now, an acupuncturist understands that the state of the spleen is very important in determining the amount of physical energy an individual has. Whereas, let's say, complaints of constant tiredness could warrant an acupuncturist to tonify a person's spleen as part of the patient's treatment protocol. But before doing so, an acupuncturist may, let's say, take a look at a person's lips. Remember that? To support their diagnosis of spleen qi or spleen blood deficiency, because the spleen manifests in the lips, as I'd stated. You see, when spleen blood or spleen qi is in a healthy state, the lips will be very moist and lustrous. But when spleen blood is deficient, the lips tend to present as pale. And when spleen yin is deficient, the lips tend to be dry. Okay? Now, I hope you was able to get something from this so far. Now I want to get into discussing patterns. Now, when I say patterns, these are disharmonies which lead to different types of disorders, potentially chronic diseases or different types of diseases when something goes wrong with the spleen. Because I want you to remember, the most important function of the spleen is that of transporting and transforming foods as well as fluids, and that's the clean, usable fluids. So any spleen disharmony will therefore always influence or affect the digestive process in a negative way. And examples of that, let's say if there's a problem with your spleen, the function of your spleen, you can experience symptoms such as, let's say, abdominal distension, lack of appetite, and loose stools. So keep in mind, like, if you experience any of those symptoms, what should now be able to ring a bell is there's something wrong with my spleen. So when I go see my acupuncturist, we can discuss this because I'm aware of it. Now, also keep in mind, as I stated, the spleen controls muscles and is responsible for transporting essences from food, qi derived from food, to the muscles throughout the body, in particular the forelimbs. So a disharmony with the spleen, again, can cause a person to feel tired, which is generally a common symptom of spleen deficiency. Now, what can represent or be the cause of a spleen pattern, a spleen disharmony? Okay, one is exterior pathogenic factors. Two can be emotional strain. And three can be as a result of poor diet. And patterns that can develop as a result of these causes can be, let's say, spleen qi deficiency, spleen yang deficiency, spleen qi sinking, spleen not controlling blood, spleen blood deficiency. Those are empty patterns. And I'm going to explain these patterns to you so you can start putting two and two together. And then you have several, or just two basic full patterns, like, let's say, cold dampness invading the spleen, or damp heat invading the spleen. As I said, I'm going to explain all of this to you. But when it comes to what can cause problems with the spleen, as I stated, exterior pathogenic factors, the spleen is easily affected by what can be considered external dampness. Now, external dampness can be a result of, you ever go outside and it just feels damp? Like there's just sort of like this sticky feeling. And most times or not, it's together with heat. You know, that's considered exterior dampness. Okay? But it can affect the body in different ways due to environmental circumstances or even life habits, such as living in a damp area, as I just explained. Dampness outside and you're constantly faced with that. Or you can have a damp house where there's a lot of mold and mildew. Also wearing wet clothes after swimming or exercising. And when it comes to wearing wet clothes, like I've had patients where their clothes wouldn't be fully dry after they attempted to dry them. But because they had to leave the house to go to work or they were in a rush to go somewhere, they would put it on and it's still slightly damp. And then by the time they get home, forget it. They're sick. There's pain, heaviness sensation to the body. But another way of yourself being affected by life habits is sitting on damp surfaces like a wet ground. Imagine sitting on the ground and it's wet for an extended period of time. Or you ever sit poolside and your wet bathing suit, bathing trunks, and the side of the pool is wet, and so are your trunks. Pay attention. Notice that after a certain point in time, you just naturally want to get up. That's your body telling you unconsciously, stand up, because this dampness is not good for you. Okay. But in general, as an exterior pathogenic factor, that being dampness, the spleen being affected by exterior dampness usually gives rise to, let's say, abdominal fullness, lack of appetite, nausea, and even a feeling of heaviness. All right. Now, it comes to emotions. How can emotions affect the spleen to an acupuncturist? One emotion is pensiveness, which is, of course, overthinking things, like really just thinking too much, brooding or thinking about the past, and even obsessive thinking. You know, you break up with someone that you obsess with. How could I lose them, and so forth. You know, that's obsessive thinking. Because pensiveness tends to stagnate chi. And a lot of times, other than the liver, it affects the spleen as well as the lungs. And also, under certain circumstances, when, let's say, a patient's diet is not good or it's irregular, pensiveness can now lead to spleen chi deficiency. Okay? So understand, include under the term of pensiveness is also excessive use of the mind in studying. You can study too much. Concentrating, memorizing too much over a long period of time. This tends to weaken a person's spleen. And I get this from college students especially, and even attorneys, politicians. They'll come into the Acupuncture My Life clinic, and I know right off the bat, it's a spleen deficiency. The spleen's been affected, pensiveness. Now guess what? Another emotion can affect the spleen, and that's worry. And for the most part, worry tends to injure the lungs primarily, but it also affects the spleen as well, because it like forms like a knot, a ball. It like puts chi in a knot, whereas, in other words, chi will stagnate. Now, along with that, if a person's diet is irregular as well, it'll also lead to spleen chi deficiency. Now, when it affects the spleen, it'll, for the most part, cause stagnation in the digestive system with symptoms of abdominal distension and pain. But speaking of diet, let me jump right into diet. Now you see the spleen is in charge of, as I stated earlier, transforming and transporting food. And diet plays an extremely important role in spleen disharmonies. Notice how when you incorporate a regular diet with emotions, what it does? Okay. So, see, the spleen prefers warm and dry types of food. And when I say warm, I mean both in terms of temperature as well as its energy. And I'm going to get into Eastern nutrition and discuss the importance of temperature and energy of foods and when you should eat them and when you should not. But all foods, you can basically classify them as either warm or hot, cool or cold. Okay? Let's say examples of warm food are meat, especially red meat. Red meat is warm, and most spices as well. And examples of cold foods are all raw foods such as salads and fruit with just a few exceptions, and vegetables with just a few exceptions, as well as ice cold drinks. And excessive consumptions of cold foods tends to impair the transformation and transporting process of the spleen, causing digestive problems and interior, not exterior, but interior dampness. And that's when you begin to get that like full, heavy sensation to you, and it affects your stools. And you'll feel phlegmish in a way. A lot of times dampness accompanies phlegm as well. All right. But the general causes for spleen disharmony again can be due to an exterior pathogenic factor, emotions, and diet. Now let me get into some specific patterns. And the basic underlying pattern of all spleen problems is spleen qi deficiency. Now, if you're ever suffering from spleen qi deficiency, you'll have a poor appetite. There'll be slight abdominal distension after eating. There'll be tiredness. There'll be a desire to lie down, pale complexion, weakness of the limbs, loose stools. And, a lot of times this happens when you eat like a lot of greasy foods. Just keep that in the back of your head. Now, diet I already spoke about. I just finished. How does that cause spleen qi deficiency? Excessive consumption of cold or raw foods, again, can hinder the spleen function of transformation and transporting and lead to spleen qi deficiency. Because again, the spleen prefers warm foods. And also, if you eat at off times, like dinner is at 5, 6 o'clock, but you're eating dinner at 9. Breakfast is usually between, let's do a range, 7 and 10 a.m. But you're eating breakfast at 12 noon. Okay? This puts a strain on the spleen's capacity to perform transformation and transporting, which would then lead to spleen qi deficiency. Okay? But now when it comes to emotional strain, again, pensiveness and worry tend to weaken the spleen, which leads to spleen qi deficiency. And then the climate, prolonged exposure to dampness, whether it's from the weather or where you live or your life habits, this can weaken the spleen and lead to spleen qi deficiency. All right? So I want you to remember that. I also want you to keep in mind, just a little side note here, when it comes to chronic diseases tend to have an underlying pattern of spleen qi deficiency. Because chronic diseases tend to weaken the spleen, leading to spleen qi deficiency. And this is the reason why dampness and phlegm are a frequent consequence of chronic diseases. If spleen qi is weakened, this leads to the formation of dampness and phlegm. That's a little side note. So do me a favor, try and remember that. Now, as you see, as I get into other patterns, I want you to keep in mind, spleen qi deficiency is usually the precursor of these other patterns, especially empty patterns, such as spleen yang deficiency, spleen qi sinking, spleen not holding the blood, spleen blood deficiency. But when it comes to spleen qi deficiency, an acupuncturist would generally look to tonify spleen qi. Now, spleen yang deficiency, it carries somewhat similar symptoms of spleen qi deficiency, which are poor appetite, slight abdominal distension after eating, tiredness, desire to lie down. But this time when you lie down, you want to curl up. And there will be a pale complexion, weakness of limbs, loose stool, and you'll feel cold along with cold limbs, and there'll be edema of the extremities. And sometimes even the face. The face will be puffy. And remember the yin and yang discussion I had earlier? If you don't, go back to it. Visit it. You guys got to remember this. All right? Yang represents heat. Yin represents cold. And when you think of yin and yang, and when yin and yang is in balance, as I stated in the yin and yang episode, you have normal body temperature ranging between 98.6, 98.7. But when one becomes deficient, the other appears as excess. So if yin is cold, yang is hot. And in this case, you have spleen yang deficiency. So that means that the heat is deficient. So it'll appear as excess cold. This is why the patient will lie down. It'll be spleen qi deficiency, as I stated, poor appetite, abdominal distension, tiredness. You just want to lie down, but this time you want to be curled up, or you want to be under a blanket or something like that. And there'll be a pale complexion with edema, cold limbs. All right? So remember that. These things are important. You know, this pattern, like I said, it's the same as spleen qi deficiency. The only difference is the exposure to cold and damp environment. Now, an acupuncturist in this case would generally look to tonify and warm spleen yang. Now, next is spleen qi sinking. Now, this is interesting because if you ever suffer from any type of prolapse where your organs begin to drop, there's your underlying reality of spleen qi deficiency. You need qi to hold the organs in place. So with spleen qi sinking, there'll be poor appetite again. Spleen qi deficiency, slight abdominal distension after eating, tiredness, pale complexion. Now there's weakness of the limbs with loose stools. Then there's depression, a tendency to obesity, a bearing down sensation in the abdomen, and let's say prolapse of the stomach, the uterus, prolapse of the anus, prolapse of the bladder, frequent and urgent urination, as well as menorrhagia. And when these symptoms present, an acupuncturist automatically knows this person is suffering from spleen qi sinking. Their spleen is weak. It's not holding the organs up in place. That's why I said qi ascends. It goes up. The qi of the spleen goes up. So an acupuncturist will look to tonify spleen qi and raise qi. Another pattern could be spleen not controlling blood. Guys, remember these symptoms. They're important. Now, spleen not controlling the blood, precursor, again, spleen qi deficiency, where there'll be poor appetite, slight abdominal distension after eating, tiredness, pale, sallow complexion. Then there's weakness of the limbs with loose stools, depression, and then there'll be blood spots under the skin. There'll also be blood in your urine and your stools, as well as excessive uterine bleeding. Now, when an acupuncturist sees this in a patient, he or she would know this is the spleen not performing its function of controlling the blood. Okay? And the treatment protocol to an acupuncturist would be tonifying spleen chi and basically stopping the bleeding. But the more serious pattern here is spleen blood deficiency. Because again, spleen chi deficiency, poor appetite, slight abdominal distension after eating, tiredness, dull pale complexion, dull because there's blood deficiency, weakness of the limbs, loose stool, depression, thin body, and scanty periods or amenorrhea, along with insomnia. That's a clear indicator. Those are clear indicators of spleen blood deficiency. Whereas an acupuncturist would tonify again spleen chi, as well as he or she would nourish the blood. Then you can even have a full pattern. Those were empty patterns where there's deficiencies. But now you can have full patterns where there's excess, where there's cold dampness affecting the spleen. Again, a patient would appear with poor appetite, feeling of fullness now in their epigastrium or abdomen, and a feeling of cold in the epigastrium, which improves with the application of heat. And it'll be like a feeling of heaviness in the head and body with a sweet taste in their mouth or absence of taste. There'll be no thirst. There'll be loose stools, tiredness, nausea, edema, a dull white complexion with excessive white vaginal discharge. These are symptoms of cold dampness that has affected the spleen, where an acupuncturist will look to resolve this dampness and expel cold. Keep in mind, when I start getting into specific diseases, a lot of these symptoms or manifestations are going to become clear. And I'll even do one more. Damp heat affecting the spleen, since I did damp cold. Damp heat, there'll be a feeling of fullness of the epigastrium or the lower abdomen, and there'll be abdominal pain, poor appetite, a feeling of heaviness, thirst without a desire to drink. There'll even be nausea, vomiting, loose stools that'll have a terrible odor. And then when you move these loose stools, there'll be a burning sensation in the anus, a feeling of heat. There'll be scanty dark urine with a low-grade fever, dull headache with feeling of heaviness of the head, dull yellow complexion. It's sort of be like your complexion would appear like as a tangerine peel. And there'll be yellow sclera of the eyes, oily sweat, bitter taste, itchy skin, or even with skin eruptions. Sweating that does not relieve your fever and does not tend to or lead to clearing of heat. Now, in that case, what would an acupuncturist do? An acupuncturist would, you got it, resolve this dampness and clear heat. See that? Some of you are getting it. And you're going to be amazed to find out what types of diseases fall under these manifestations. You're really going to be surprised in the future. But like I said, this is why I'm going over the functions of the internal organs, as well as patterns that can accompany them, or patterns that cause disharmony of that particular internal organ, so that you'll see when some of these manifestations combine with manifestations from other internal organs, you'll be shocked. So this is what autoimmune, this type of autoimmune disorder is, or this chronic ailment. You'll be shocked. And you'll see how an acupuncturist can treat them. You know, acupuncture is my life. You know what? If you want to learn more, visit our YouTube channel under Acupuncture is My Life, and do me a favor. Attempt to start making acupuncture a part of your life. because acupuncture is my life. What's yours?